Hey folks, Bohaus from Independent Solutions here. The year 1976 witnessed a watershed moment in British post-war history. It was the year the United Kingdom, once a proud imperial power, was forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The event sent shockwaves through the nation, shaking its confidence and revealing the fragility of its economic foundations. This was not just an economic crisis, it was a crisis of national identity. The crisis came to a head on a day that became etched in British memory as Black Wednesday. On that day, the value of the pound sterling plummeted on international markets. The Bank of England, despite desperate attempts to prop up the currency, was forced to withdraw from the foreign exchange market. The writing was on the wall. Britain was in dire straits. The IMF loan, a staggering $3.9 billion, came with stringent conditions. It demanded deep cuts in public spending and a radical shift in economic policy. This marked a turning point in British politics, paving the way for the rise of Margaret Thatcher and the dawn of Thatcherism. The events of 1976 serve as a potent reminder of the interconnectedness of the global economy and the humbling reality that even the mightiest of nations can stumble. It is a story of hubris, mismanagement, and the painful process of national reckoning. To understand the 1976 crisis, we must first delve into the long shadow cast by Britain's imperial past. The Second World War, while ultimately a victory, had left the British economy exhausted. The costs of maintaining a global empire had become unsustainable. The post-war years saw the gradual dismantling of this empire, dealing a further blow to Britain's global standing. The loss of empire had profound economic consequences. Britain was no longer the centre of a vast trading network, and its industries, slow to modernise, faced stiff competition from rivals like Germany and Japan. This decline was further exacerbated by a chronic lack of investment in new technologies and infrastructure. The Labour government, in power for much of the post-war era, attempted to manage this decline through a combination of nationalisation and Keynesian economic policies. While these measures provided a safety net for many, they also led to inefficiencies and a growing public sector. The stage was set for a perfect storm. The 1970s saw the emergence of a new economic threat: stagflation. This toxic combination of economic stagnation and high inflation proved a nightmare for policymakers around the world. The oil crisis of 1973, triggered by an embargo by Arab oil-producing nations, further fueled inflation, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Britain, heavily reliant on imported oil, was particularly vulnerable. The sharp rise in oil prices sent the cost of living soaring, eroding living standards and sparking widespread industrial unrest. Strikes by miners, dock workers and other essential workers crippled the economy, further fueling the inflationary spiral. The Labour government, led by Harold Wilson and later James Callaghan, struggled to contain the crisis. Their attempts to control inflation through price controls and income policies proved largely ineffective, only serving to exacerbate shortages and undermine business confidence.
I inherited an unenviable legacy, an economy in shambles, rampant inflation and a growing sense of national malaise. The trade unions, once a pillar of Labour's support, had become increasingly militant, adding to the sense of crisis.
James Callaghan, a seasoned politician known for his pragmatism, assumed the mantle of Prime Minister in 1976. Callaghan, recognising the gravity of the situation, abandoned his predecessor's more interventionist approach. He recognised the need for fiscal restraint to curb inflation, but faced stiff resistance from within his own party. The Labour Party was deeply divided, with the left wing advocating for increased public spending and nationalisation, while moderates urged caution. This internal division paralysed the government, making it difficult to implement a coherent economic strategy. Meanwhile, the value of the pound continued its downward spiral, reflecting a growing lack of confidence in the British economy. The winter of 1976 was one of the bleakest in British post-war history.
A series of crippling strikes by public sector workers brought the country to a standstill.
Rubbish piled up in the streets, schools were closed, and hospitals struggled to cope.
The Winter of Discontent, as it became known, exposed the fragility of British society and the deep divisions within the labour movement.
The strikes further undermined the already fragile economy.
The government's budget deficit ballooned as tax revenues plummeted and spending on unemployment benefits soared.
International investors, alarmed by the deteriorating situation, began to lose faith in the British economy.
The pound sterling, once a symbol of British strength, came under intense speculative attack.
Despite desperate attempts by the Bank of England to defend the currency, it continued to slide.
The situation was becoming untenable, and the government was running out of options.
With the pound in freefall and the economy teetering on the brink, Callaghan was left with a stark choice: national bankruptcy or the humiliation of seeking a bailout from the International Monetary Fund.
Swallowing my pride, I opted for the latter.
In September 1976, the British government formally requested a loan from the IMF. The decision to approach the IMF was a watershed moment in post-war British history. It shattered the illusion of Britain as a great power, capable of managing its own affairs.
The IMF loan, while necessary to avert disaster, came with a heavy price. We demanded strict conditions, including deep cuts in public spending, higher interest rates, and a commitment to reducing the size of the public sector.
These measures, while necessary to stabilize the economy, were deeply unpopular and would have profound political consequences. The IMF loan came with a series of stringent conditions designed to restore fiscal discipline and curb inflation. Public spending was slashed, leading to job losses in the public sector and cuts in social programs. Interest rates were raised to curb borrowing and stabilize the currency. These measures, while necessary, proved deeply unpopular.
The Labour government, already deeply divided, was further split by the IMF's demands. The left wing of the party saw the cuts as a betrayal of Labour's core values, while moderates argued that they were necessary to save the economy. This internal division paralysed the government, making it difficult to implement the IMF's programme effectively.
The austerity measures had a profound impact on British society. Unemployment rose sharply, and living standards for many fell. The social unrest of the Winter of Discontent was a direct result of the government's attempts to impose wage restraint. The IMF bailout, while averting economic collapse, had come at a high social and political cost. The IMF loan, combined with a gradual decline in oil prices, helped to stabilize the British economy. Inflation began to fall and the pound recovered some of its lost value. However, the recovery was slow and painful. Unemployment remained high, and the deep cuts in public spending left many feeling disillusioned and resentful.
The Labour government, tainted by the experience of the IMF bailout and the Winter of Discontent, was decisively defeated in the 1979 general election. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party, promising to roll back the frontiers of the state and restore economic prosperity, swept to power.
The 1976 crisis marked a turning point in British politics. It shattered the post-war consensus on the role of government and paved the way for the rise of Thatcherism, with its emphasis on free markets, individualism, and a smaller state. The legacy of the crisis would continue to shape British politics and society for decades to come. The 1976 IMF crisis cast a long shadow over British politics. It marked the end of the post-war consensus and the beginning of a new era of austerity, privatisation, and a more market-driven economy. Margaret Thatcher, who came to power in the wake of the crisis, drew upon the lessons of 1976 to justify her radical programme of economic reform. Thatcher argued that the crisis was a symptom of a deeper malaise, the expansion of the state, excessive union power, and a culture of dependency. Her solution was to roll back the frontiers of the state, curb union power, and promote individual responsibility. Her policies, while controversial and often painful, transformed the British economy and society. The 1976 crisis serves as a reminder of the fragility of economic stability and the importance of sound economic management. It is a story of hubris, mismanagement, and the painful process of national reckoning. It is also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a nation can find the resilience to recover and rebuild.